Good, just going to test the audio here, just to make sure the microphone's coming through and see how loud it is. To anyone watching, hello. Give me a sec. Okay, just a quick test of the audio, see if that's coming through. This should work. Can people hear me? I can't hear myself, which isn't the best. Hello, me. Why do I have no sound? Hello? Sound through. Let's try. One sec. Sorry about this. I did have this working, but apparently not. Hello? Any sound at all? Oh yeah, I do have sound. Yeah, oh cool. Good. Okay. Yeah, the monitor I was using over here. Okay. Cool. So it's 12:02. I'll give people a few more minutes to show up if they want to. Hey, excellent. Cool. Good. Excellent. Yeah, sorry about that. Not tried this before. Not live anyway, so we'll see. This should be pretty much like a kind of a normal session, but maybe with a bit less kind of active engagement sort of thing, but we'll kind of see how it goes. So yeah, thanks for showing up, those who have. 10's not too bad considering it's a bit weird, but yeah. Okay, let's roll. So yeah, as I say, it's very experimental. Excuse any technical difficulties, we'll kind of work through them. Basically the plan is just a big outline, just to clear up any issues, maybe answer issues that crop up in chat, things like that. Didn't get any questions through email, but that's fine. We're going to go through the theory, then the globalization stuff, and then questions. It's essentially just all the stuff we did over the course of the year, just run through it. Not in huge detail, because I can't sit here for that many hours, because that would take a long time. But we're just going to go over things and see where questions crop up and any issues that people have. And that's pretty much the plan. The latency isn't too bad, so there, it's about 5 seconds-ish, so keep that in mind when asking questions. Right. Oh, and with added memes, of course, because you'll like memes. It's from this intensely radical international relations memes group on Facebook. Yeah, it's Facebook. It's where old people hang out and spread racist stuff. It's fine. But yeah, just dumb memes. They're fun. They're stupid. They're interspersed throughout. I thought it was a bit silly, but hey, cool. My slides tend to look fairly boring otherwise. Right. So to give an overall thing, we'll have like a tea break maybe in between the two where we would have the split in semesters. So after we finish with the theory, we'll have like a bit of time to grab like a cup of tea or something, and we can go through it from there. Okay. So theory fundamentals. We're going to go through the theory. This is essentially a week by week as we went through. It can be as simple or as complicated as you like. The slides are just kind of a jumping off point. So yeah, Marxism, critical theory, realism, liberalism, constructivism, English school feminism, post-structuralism, post-colonialism. And then we'll kind of do a bit at the end talking about how the wider landscape looks and how those theories interact with each other and the different groupings as well. Because I think that's quite helpful and important in terms of understanding their critiques of each other, because they tend to end up grouped together in different camps, as it were. And then I'll take, there's no we, I'll take questions from chat, and but we can kind of see where people are having issues, if people are. I trust everyone's kind of doing okay. Keith's got his revision sessions like IRL next week, so that'd be good. I'm just throwing this out there as a thing. Also, if the reception of this is good, I might do another one later on closer to the exam. But that's smack bang in the middle of like Easter and exam marking. Oh no, it will be before exam marking, but it's smack bang in the middle of Easter, so that's a maybe. Okay, so starting, first things first, Marxism. The key terms. So I grabbed key terms for this from, one sec. You guessed it, Oliver Dadau's book, International Relations Theory. Good book, useful stuff. Not all completely lining up with the module, but theory is kind of a variable thing anyway. But yeah, we started with Marxism because it's better than starting with realism and liberalism. They're just a bit dull to start with. So yes, capitalism, class, historical materialism, imperialism, inequality, and world system. You can throw theory on the end of that, so you can like turn it into world systems theory if you want. So it's a normative approach, but there's a blend of positivism in there as well. It depends on who you ask. As it says here, historical materialism doesn't really allow much room for individual agency, which tends to drag a lot of the normativity out of the theory, because capitalism will end through some kind of inevitable historical process, according to kind of historical materialism at its most basic, which there's not much room for individual agency, people to do stuff apart from maybe fight back against the worst of capitalism, but then maybe you're just dragging it out. Anyway, so to some extent normative, but also very structural in the sense that historical materialism follows a certain set of processes. It's a sociological historical process. Class is central. That runs through everything. With the earlier Marxisms, class is within the state. With kind of later Marxism stuff, things like Wallerstein, class is above the state, right? So we have class divides between states, the core periphery, and etc. So yes, useful when discussing globalization, especially because we can draw in ideas from Lenin and his discussions of imperialism as kind of the next form of capitalism, as it were. But that depends on kind of how you're going to interpret it. But yes, so not an overly critical thing. This is way back. This is week 1. Old school Marxism, I wouldn't say is particularly common in IR, but certainly kind of world systems theory is kicking about still. This is not a critical approach in the sense that it's not self-critical. We'll get to that in a second. So yes, Marxism in its most basic. Right. So, critical theory. Key terms similar to the previous: capitalism, communicative action, emancipation, hegemony, history, legitimacy, order, and state. This is an explicitly normative approach. It's critical. There is not any kind of idea of objective knowledge. Instead, knowledge is subjective, and the best we can hope for maybe is intersubjective knowledge with some kind of ethical goal at the end of it. That's kind of where that goes. Derived from Marxist theory, so you'll see a lot of the same kinds of terms. You'll see talks of class and things like this. In some cases, it's referred to as Marxian theory to distinguish it from Marxist theory. Yes, they share a lot of kind of genetics, as it were. It's heavily derived from Gramsci, looking at capitalism and essentially asking the question, if capitalism is to inevitably fail, why hasn't it? Why hasn't capitalism actually failed yet? Surely with the massive wealth disparity, people would get to a point where they go, well, this is silly. And it's essentially asking the question, why? It has three main stages, kind of those derived from the Frankfurt School, then Jürgen Habermas, and then Robert Cox and Andrew Linklater, who are kind of the newer. So the Frankfurt School is much older stuff. We're talking things like Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer. So I'm just looking at dialectic of enlightenment over there. They are interested in questions of modernity, and essentially the Frankfurt School was interested in answering the question of how can something like the Holocaust happen in modernity, because it wasn't barbarism per se, it wasn't any kind of old thought processes that happened in modernity, and they were interested in asking those questions. And that expands through into Habermas, who extends that critique. And there's still those that use Habermas quite extensively. One of my supervisors does. And then as we get through, we go into kind of like the Robert Cox and Andrew Linklater territory, with Robert Cox being more IPE-ish, and then Andrew Linklater leaning towards kind of cosmopolitan identity construction kind of stuff. But these are kind of broad schools. Critical theory is fundamentally looking at the focus on ideas and hegemony within ideas, or the hegemony of ideas as well. Things like neoliberalism within capitalism, for example, that has become a hegemonic norm within capitalism to a point where it's quite difficult to imagine pushing anything else seriously. There were a lot of questions asked around 2008 as to why is it after 2008 and this massive collapse of free market capitalism that people are only talking about more free market capitalism as a solution rather than something else. There's also hegemonic ideas of class. An interesting one is the idea of like the American dream, as it were, that anyone can become rich if they work hard, which ignores a whole lot of underlying issues with that and with societal disparity and things like this. But it's a very useful way of stopping people from kicking up a fuss because they haven't got any money, because they just assume they haven't worked hard enough. It's kind of insipid in that sense. And as a result of this, we end up with this critical epistemology, right? So ideas are important, ideas are powerful, there's no value-free knowledge, and therefore it recognises the role of academia, research, the media, pretty much anyone who's saying something in propagating hegemonic norms, maintaining systems of oppression, or systems of control, I suppose would be another way of putting it. And essentially the goal of the research is emancipation. So without that end goal of objective free knowledge, they push for emancipatory knowledge that can break down structures of control. This was like really big back in 2010-ish. It's taken a bit of a hit recently, but yeah. So that's essentially a critical theory. It's useful, very dynamic. That critical epistemology makes it very helpful, but it also, I'll add, it has kind of, because of that emancipatory role, it has a moral and ethical grounding, which stops it from floating away in terms of morals in the same way that, say, post-structuralism does. That emancipation is set very much within kind of a framework of individual liberty. It looks like old liberalism in some cases. So yeah, keep that in mind. It's not as free-flowing. Cool. Okay, and there you go. There's a... It's not actually me, but I quite like that one. Okay, so realism. Moving on to kind of the older school stuff, and newer school, depending on whether you want it. So you've got the key terms: anarchy, human nature, interest, power, security dilemma, and the state. This is a positivist approach in all of its manifestations. Objective value, free knowledge of the world is possible, according to realism. For classical forms of realism, this is more based around just an understanding that the fundamental philosophy is correct, and that therefore the knowledge that comes out of it is correct as well. For the kind of the neo-realists, that stems from faith in the scientific methodology, the idea that the knowledge that it produces is value-free. State is the key actor. We kind of know realism, right? The state is the key actor, right? There's not a huge amount beyond it. Other stuff does exist. International institutions do exist, but generally they're an extension of state power. Major corporations might exist, but again, extension of state power and that sort of thing. A very Hobbesian understanding of human nature. Human nature is set, contrasting dramatically with what we just looked at, right? So previously with critical theory, things are socially constructed in the way that ideas are important, whereas here human nature is set. It is one thing. Life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, and therefore humans group together into defensive groups and things like the state and such. And humans are inherently self-interested according to this as well. And also rational. I should have added rational to the slide. There's a faith in rational thinking and rational decision making, especially with neo-realism. This understanding of human nature extends up to the state level. So the state is essentially a replacement for the individual in the state of anarchy that they're all existing in. So it's essentially the same form of anarchy, but the state is existing in it instead of just the individual. Neo-realism grows out a bit, pushes a scientific approach, observation-based approach, trying to abandon the philosophical foundations, replacing them with kind of objective observations. The quality of the objectivity of that is debatable. For critical theorists, the folks we just looked at, this is big no-no. Like, it's not objective at all. It's all embedded within power structures and kind of structures of oppression and such. Realisms and the lack of critical epistemology means that they face criticism. Yep, from critical and post-positivist approaches. So critical theory, feminism, post-structuralism, post-colonialism as well. So yeah, although I will say there is a shared suspicion of ethical and moral claims between realism and post-structuralism. So when someone says they're invading a country for a moral reason, the folks putting up most fuss are probably going to be realists and post-structuralists. They're both very suspicious of ethics and moral politics. So yes, realism. There's also neoclassical, which is kind of a bit of neorealism, but bringing some of the older school philosophy and some of the understanding of individual agency back in from classical realism. If realism floats your boat, that's probably the best place to go nowadays, because I think it's where the more interesting realism stuff is, I guess. But yeah, cool. There you go. I told you they were dumb memes. Like, they're really They're verging on shit posts. Okay. So, liberalism. Anarchy, but cooperation, democracy, democratic peace theory, institutions, interdependence, international organisation, peace, progress, security dilemma, and state. I have additional stuff to say on democratic peace theory in a sec. This is a normative approach. It's explicitly ethical in its nature, or moral in its nature. Liberalism has core normative values. These are related to the idea of progress, that humankind is on a kind of path of liberal progress and that we're just progressing along it. This also gives us the end goal as well, which, at least with classical liberalism, can seem a bit utopian because you have that utopian end goal at the end of the stretch. I've gone off camera, end of the stretch. So yes, it is not necessarily normative, not necessarily value-free. Neoliberalism to an extent is, but that's because it's pushing more for kind of good economic policy, following privatization as such. Again, like the classical side of realism, the neo side of realism, the neoliberalism kind of pushes away from the foundationalist side of things, from the philosophy. The state is still a key actor in IR, not the only actor, but certainly key. The state does exist in a form of anarchy, but it's not the same kind of anarchy as realism. It's more a lack of solid hierarchical structures of influence over the state. Because ultimately, within liberalism, it's not really that necessary to have those hierarchical structures because the states are cooperative. As a result of the Rousseauian kind of understanding of human nature. Again, human nature is set. Again, contrasting dramatically with CT, humans are inherently cooperative. Yes, there is still a state of anarchy, but states deal with it through cooperation. They form international institutions and things like this. The security dilemma, as it were, is dealt with through cooperation and diplomacy and things like that. As with realism, the understanding of human nature extends up to the state. The state essentially becomes a human individual on kind of like the wider level. But yes, institution building as well. On that topic, I'll throw in some extra democratic peace theory stuff. So DPT is interesting in terms of it does make a lot of sense, right? The idea that democracies don't go to a war seems logical because it's people that have to go to war. But there's some caveats with that as well. Democracies generally don't go to war with each other, but they do have a habit of going to war with non-democracies. So there are some components of democratic peace theory that rely on democratic states just being more peaceful in their nature. That's more difficult to support in kind of DPT style, because we see the United States, which is democratic and loves to go to war. UK has gone to war, etc. Like there's a lot of examples of democratic states that go to war. It's not kind of an inherent democratic thing not to. The idea that democratic states don't go to war with other democratic states is more supportable. But we also have to ask questions as to how far we're defining democracy as well. What constitutes a democracy, what level of democracy and things like this. There are stats and numbers available for this kind of thing. Use those, but use them carefully because they will have been compiled according to some kind of democratic index, which might not necessarily be that fantastic. Again, it's the same with most stat stuff. Just be really wary about how they've gathered the stats and parsed them and kind of run them through algebra and stuff. So yes, neoliberalism grows out of this a bit. It goes on to a more scientific study, abandoning those philosophical foundations. It's neoliberal institutionalism especially kind of draws out from this. It ends up talking about similar things to constructivism at times. So constructivism, if you want to look at institutions, constructivism is probably more interesting and useful. But if you want to kind of jump on that neoliberal train, then go right ahead. there's a lot of work on it. The liberalisms and the lack of critical epistemology means that they face criticism. So it's a similar kind of avenues of criticism as for realism, only in this case there's criticisms that come from, say, post-colonial scholars about this idea of progress, because it's very grounded in a Western idea of what progress is. This concept of human progression through these liberal values, which are very, very set within kind of a Euro-American kind of idea on how society should develop, how the world should look, and things like this. There's the old infamous end of history from Francis Fukuyama. Poor guy. There were quite a few memes actually bashing on him, but I can't remember if one's next, but I guess we'll see. So yes, keep that in mind. As bad as neorealism was at talking about the end of the Cold War, liberalism was at talking about the end of the Cold War. Yes. Cool. Okay, so moving on to constructivism. Bit different. This course exists on kind of a spectrum between kind of normative and scientific. Key terms: anarchy, identity, norm, security, dilemma, state. Again, very similar to the others. Want to kind of pick up on the identity. Positivist-ish approach. Generally, they are not... Ooh, I spelled positivist wrong there. Generally, they're not kind of very strictly scientific, but they will, at a certain end of the spectrum, push scientific methodologies, because there's an understanding that knowledge and ideas are socially constructed. There's a degree of flexibility that the previous two approaches don't have. Because critical theory does have it, but that has it tied into a whole kind of ethical, moral, emancipatory justification. And constructivism is a bit different. It generally avoids overly normative conclusions, but also at the same time, constructivism will sort of avoid purely objective truth conclusions as well. The state is still recognised as a key actor. I'll point this out. Constructivism is very dynamic in that it can talk about a lot of the same stuff as realism and a lot of the same stuff as liberalism, but it doesn't necessarily have to subscribe to their particular requirements, those foundational ideas on what the world is, what the state is, and things like that. This makes it quite useful because we can view, say, realist foreign policy as a socially constructed norm, and we can still use realist ideas to understand what people are doing because they're following these realist ideas because it's a socially constructed norm. Not that I'm trying overly hard to sell constructivism, but it's very useful, and it shouldn't be dismissed as kind of a middle-of-the-road approach that can't do what others can. It can do a lot of the same stuff as liberalism, for example. It can look at international institutions and things like that. It doesn't have to kind of steer clear of those issues. It can do the same things, and often with a bit more pizzazz and nuance, if pizzazz is the wrong word. Yes, unlike the previous two approaches, no set human nature. This is quite important. Human nature is socially constructed. It depends on cultural norms, societal norms, upbringing, that sort of thing. This means that can extend up into the state level in the same way as the others, and it means that we don't have a set way of states doing things. There's the old anarchy is what states make of it, right? And in that case, a lot of the previous two approaches that we've looked at become very different in our understanding. Yes, it comes under fire from both sides, right? It's that middle of the road approach that's going to not necessarily satisfy anyone completely, but it's going to satisfy enough people enough to a degree. It's not scientific enough or positivist enough for the positivists, your realists, liberals, etc. And it's not normatively aware enough for the post-positivists. Constructivism isn't asking difficult questions about the role of the scholar or the role of the constructivist scholar in the construction of knowledge and that sort of thing. which becomes an issue for more kind of normatively driven approaches. They do have some questions, but again, it's not the same level. Okay, constructivism. It's cool stuff. It's useful. Oh, there we go. Ooh, I'm in the way. There you go. There you go. Right, put me back. Okay. So English school. Moving on to a more historically grounded approach. Key terms: justice, order, pluralism, rules, society, solidarism, state and system. Again, this is like constructivism. It's a positivist-ish approach. It's not quite fully one thing or the other. It kind of varies. If I was forced to describe it, I'd say it's kind of a historical methodology, or historicism methodology applied to IR. It's very much kind of, it feels a lot like stuff that historians do. The state is still recognised as a key actor, again, but it's part of this kind of global society, as it were, that is tied through to a long history. This is different from, say, the neo approaches, because the neo approaches look at the world as they see it, like as now. They don't think about the history. They don't think about the kind of relationship with the social, with the kind of the social society and things like that. They're just looking at it now. With the English school, all of the history side of things is important as well, and that's quite useful and important. And it can give you a different understanding of the politics of the situation, to know the kind of the historical context of it, and that's helpful. So there's two different approaches here. So you've got solidarism and pluralism. Hopefully this kind of will make sense anyway, but it's just kind of to refresh your memory. Solidarism is closest to cosmopolitanism, this idea that it's plausible to have a cohesive global society where everyone kind of gets along and has similar-ish kind of social norms and social ideas. Things like universal human rights, for example. Solidarism would state that universal human rights is plausible, that there is kind of a historical social norm for implementing this kind of thing. Whereas pluralism, the other side of it, is more, well, pluralistic. The idea that that form of cosmopolitanism, that form of kind of global societal integration is not necessarily that possible, because there are cultural differences in different places. It's more aligned with realism, but mostly on the side of things of cultural differences within states and just differences in general, rather than power relations and things like this. It receives much the same criticism as constructivism. They, at the edges, they're very, very similar. They kind of blur into one another at the edges. And also, the English school has quite a difficult history, I suppose, to kind of deal with, which, when dealing with post-colonialism, for example, is probably going to come up at some point. But yes, largely it's an interesting approach. It's very good. It's making kind of a good comeback, as it were. Right. So feminism. I mean, to reiterate, it's not just really feminism. Within IR, it goes by various different names. Feminism, kind of gender-aware theory, queer theory in some cases as well. Feminism is a useful but quite lazy tag that gets attached to it, and also ends up kind of wrapped up into people's warped, broken ideas of what feminism is within real society and things like this. So, yeah, it's more broad than that. It's looking at more than just femininity. So, key terms: gender, masculine, feminine, patriarchy, rationality, security, and sovereignty. We're making that jump into the post-positivist space properly now. We had a brief look at it with critical theory, but now we're kind of really jumping in, all guns blazing at this point. So this is a critical epistemology with a focus on gender. So to reiterate, epistemology is how we know what we know, essentially. So questioning the foundations of knowledge. and in this case we're questioning the gendered foundations of knowledge. It's interesting, constructive ideas of gender, and also the associated power relations and the way that gendered ideas of knowledge influence decision making, things like that. There's a huge amount of intersectionality here. Feminism can be combined with Marxism, liberalism, post-structuralism, post-colonialism. Global society is shot through with gender, it's shot through with issues in terms of just, it runs through the entire lot. So definitely keep in mind that this is very useful in that sense. At the same time, be wary. Liberal feminism, for example, is probably going to run up against post-structural feminism. There will probably be a conflict of some sort there, because liberal feminism is not necessarily as critically aware or willing to be as some of the more critical approaches. It can be a fascinating, very valuable tool. Almost nothing sits beyond its influence. It's very useful, dynamic. It can be complicated to get hold of, to get like a grasp of, because there's quite a lot of post-structural stuff that goes into things as well, especially when we end up looking at the power relations of constructed ideas of gender. But again, it's a very valuable and useful way of looking at things. But yes, it's as interested in masculinity as it is in femininity, as I was saying right at the start. But yes, it doesn't. This is very much where these go from paradigms in the loosest sense to turns or lenses, because unlike the other approaches, feminism doesn't really have set rules in terms of how one looks at things and how one does things. There's no kind of set methodology, for example. Because of that intersectionality, it varies a bit. And we see this a lot throughout all of the really post-positivist stuff, the really critical stuff. So yes, keep in mind these things. Post-structuralism, the old chestnut. So key terms: deconstruction, decourse, genealogy, identity, power knowledge, and sovereignty. It's probably the most critical of the post-positivist space. Makes it very, very powerful, but makes it also very, very difficult. If critical theory, for example, is very self-aware, then post-structuralism is even more so, to the point that they get accused of navel-gazing. Focus on discourse and power knowledge. So we're looking, it's similar to looking at the socially constructed ideas of constructivism, and it's also similar to looking at the power of ideas and hegemonic ideas in critical theory, only taking it further and really breaking down the discourse and looking at the fundamental components of language, discourse, the way language is used. Also looking at how the construction of identity stems from these things as well. And the history of this kind of through genealogy. Again, lots of intersectionality. Post-structuralism and feminism can be brought together very, very well, but we also see kind of post-structuralism, post-structural post-colonialism, and this kind of thing. It's useful, challenging, if you're going to focus, I suppose, on a couple of scholars. Foucault isn't a bad person to go to, or at least read up on like guides to Foucault or Foucault's ideas within IR. There's Derridian stuff as well. The textbook is probably going to be your best starting point, or something like International Relations Theory or something by Dadaw. It covers at least the basics and gives you a good fundamental understanding of what they're talking about. It can be difficult to get into because the language is sometimes a pain, but it can also be very, very useful as a tool of IR. If you don't like it now, maybe, I don't know, keep it in mind for later on. This approach finds criticism from the positivist side of IR. So positivism isn't very fond of this. For the positivists, this is wishy-washy, silly philosophy, essentially, that doesn't really have any bearing on reality. ironically, normally it's the dismissal which is kind of representative of the very problem that positivist IR has, but there you go. It gets critique from critical theory for abandoning that emancipatory goal, or not having a firm idea on what that emancipation is. The problem with post-structuralism is that it's relatively easy to twist it into something else, because it's so critical it ends up with kind of a mess of very critical ideas, and that itself generates problems. So yes, there's a bit of conflict between those, even though hypothetically they're saying similar things. So yeah, keep that in mind. There you go. There's a... I quite like that one. I'll leave that up there. I want a cup of drink. So yes. Right. Post-colonialism. Key terms: discourse, empire, ethnicity, identity, knowledge, power, and the subaltern. Again, critical epistemology, focus on colonialism and empire, the wake of empire, and also the potential for continued discourses of empire in the wake of formalized empire. So maybe some discussions of neo-imperialism, but depending on how critical you go, it could just be the continuation of certain discourses of empire through just norms and social values and things like this. I think in the seminars we talked about problems with British society and how it's related to the colonial history and the lack of ability to process that and things like that. So it's stuff like that, including things like academia, for example. There's a big drive to decolonize IR, for example. Again, as before, lots of intersectionality, because it doesn't have like a set rulebook in terms of methodology, and it has an open kind of critical epistemology. You can intermix it with different approaches. So post-colonial feminism, very cool. Post-structuralism, again, very, very good, very effective. If you're looking at deconstructing texts that have maybe represent the continuation of a colonial legacy, then post-structuralism is top notch. Yep, it's because they have compatible ontologies and epistemologies. The critical epistemology is very valuable for them. And it means that they end up being able to work together in ways that, say, realism and liberalism struggle to, because if you have two differing, fundamentally opposite understandings of what human nature is, it's going to be difficult to figure out a theory or figure out some way of working together. The approach finds criticism dismissal from the positivist side of IR because of its post-positivism and its lack of scientific elements. Anything that isn't pushing for objective knowledge is going to come into criticism from the positivist side. But hey, that just means they're doing their job, right? Cool. There you go. Clash of Civilizations is rubbish. It's written for a specific audience. But hey, it's an interesting read, I suppose. You just have to kind of read it take it with a pinch of salt. There you go. Okay. So the wider picture. Positivist, post-positivist. So positivism here, associated with an understanding of objective and value-free knowledge. Post-positivism is the idea that it is not. Normativity, a moral underpinning, for researchers might be liberal values of liberalism or the emancipatory values of CT. This relates to the above two, because within positivism, knowledge is sought for the sake of knowledge. We seek objective knowledge because once we have it, it is true, it's out there, it's written down, we don't have to concern about it. We do the study, we write down the results, we stick it in a book, put it in the library, and that's done. Sorted. If that isn't objectively true knowledge, then there has to be a different reason for doing the research. And more often than not, a normative reason is brought into this. So for critical theory especially, it's that emancipatory goal, emancipating people people from structures of oppression and structures of control. That is the reason they do research, rather than looking for objective value-free knowledge. Liberalism, slightly different. It has that normativity built into its kind of philosophical core, but it's still positivist. It's a weird mix, and a confusing one. So paradigm lens approach. You'll see paradigm used a lot. Keith and I this year have moved away from that because it generally is too related to kind of a scientific understanding of IR, which doesn't really reflect the more critical side of where the discipline's gone. And that's kind of why we've gone for lens or approach or turn. These are kind of groupings, and they're always going to be slightly fuzzy because you'll have academics that sit outside, well, they claim they sit outside of it, but they don't, or they sit between them, or that kind of thing. So, yeah, be wary of that. But generally, yes, this is the best way of grouping these together at this stage. Scientific versus traditional approaches. Covered this a little bit when looking at liberalism and neoliberalism. The neo approaches, again, represent a shift towards scientific approaches. They are moving away from grounding their theory in philosophy, the foundational basis, and they are moving towards grounding their theory in objective observation, the scientific method, and things like that. And that is the big split. That's the classic neo split, essentially. And yeah, treat these with a degree of caution. They are useful for this stage of theory building, but as ever, the more you learn, the more complicated it's going to get. Yes, be wary of it, especially binaries. Okay, and then just this, you should recognize this, I hope. We have the positivist, we have normative. There are some issues with this in terms of placement, but for the most part it's not too bad. The distinction between positivist and normative, I would kind of extend that, thinking about the slide we had before. But yes, this is a pretty good kind of general gist, and you've got social constructivism in the middle there, kind of doing its thing. And again, I think this is from this one as well, so yeah, it's useful having my books with me. Okay, so that's kind of the run over of the theory stuff. I say it was fairly brief. It still took 50 odd minutes, but there you go. Are there any questions, issues, problems? Just throw them in chat if you want to, and I'll kind of answer them as we go, I think. Is it all that clear? Cool. Well, in that case, I guess I will. Yeah. So what I'm probably going to do, I think the next thing planned is probably like a tea break or something. Maybe for like 5 or so minutes to give my voice a break, essentially. Grab a cup of tea, some biscuits or whatever. I freaking love that picture of that guy. I'm so dumb. The things you can find on Google image search. But yeah, so 5-10 minutes, and then afterwards we'll hit up the semester 2 stuff. Because it's not as kind of teachy. It probably won't take quite as long. But yeah, have a short break, grab a cup of tea. I'm going to mute my mic and I'm going to kind of probably get some biscuits to go with my cup of coffee or something. So yeah, I'll be back in 5 or 10 minutes. Oh yeah, beer break. I wish. I ran out of beer last night. So yeah, tea, coffee, beer, whatever. That's the great thing about a live stream. You can do what the hell you like. So yes, I'll be back in like 5 minutes or so, 5-10 minutes. And I'll see you then. So grab a cup of tea and I'll see you in a bit. The reason I have the curtains closed, by the way, is because if I have them open, it just blows the contrast out on this camera. Sucks. I think it's just a consequence of the arrangement in this room. Right. 56. Recharged. Should we get back to it? I think so. Right. So, we looked over all the semester 1 stuff, theory, that's all cool. That should be kind of hopefully at least drawn from the depth of memory. If not, you know, always send me an email. Responses might be a bit slower depending on the complexity of the email at this moment. I'm doing a bit of research and stuff, waiting for exams to come in, but always do send me an email. It'll probably only be a couple of days at most. So, and if not me, then Keith. And Keith's having the revision system as well. So, perfect. Cool. Right. Let's crack on. Globalization. So that's kind of the general theme that we can use to look at what we've talked about in the second semester, right? It's nearly all been talking about globalization in one way or another. So yeah, again, like before, it's essentially week by week. Very formulaic. Globalization, global governance, IPE, regionalism, nationalism, cosmopolitanism, war, humanitarian intervention, terrorism, poverty and development, and the environment. So we'll go through these. Again, there's not much like information to push on these, except to kind of raise certain components and identify certain aspects. I will probably, sorry, the cat. I will probably throw some like theory ideas at you in terms of what theory would be kind of fun or interesting to use, and then at the end we'll look at the discussions of wider themes and then questions from chat. I also remembered I tacked onto the end of this some kind of like revision tip stuff. So the chances are just go through that. You don't have to hang around for it. It's kind of up to you. I completely forgot to throw it on the end actually. Yeah, that's just in case you want some kind of revision tips or things like that. Then that might be helpful. So that's there. I just remembered to put it in. That's all. Okay. So yes, but for this moment, globalization stuff. Okay. So there you go. Well, oh, the poor ICC. You know, the US, I think they revoked a visa for a key ICC person who was looking into war crimes in Afghanistan. US doesn't like the ICC. Anyway. So yeah, globalization. Globalization? The McGrew definition. Those of you that wrote essays on this, you did good. I enjoyed the globalization essays. Historical process involving a fundamental shift of transformation in the spatial scale of human social organisation that links distant communities and expands the reach of power relations across regions and continents. Globalization is kind of a useful term, but it's also quite a risky term to use because it's generally quite vague. So be wary of that. Use a proper definition that you can ground. If you're going to revise a definition, then that's probably one of the ones you want to do. The McGrew one will do. That's a fine definition. But remember, there's different components of it. And it's part of wider processes as well. Globalization doesn't spring up out of nowhere. You have colonialism, then you have the process of decolonization, which then kind of goes hand in hand with globalization. So keep that in mind. It's not just a magical fairy that sprung from existence at the click of a finger. It's part of historical global sociological processes. The English school, for example, would say similar, to be fair. There's different components as well. There's the economic components, some military components, things like conflict is changing, legal components with international institutions, things like the ICC, Ecological components, big one. We'll talk about that right at the end because that's kind of the last week. Cultural components with cosmopolitanism, we've already talked about that a little bit with kind of Andrew Linklater stuff and a bit of English school. And then social, which, to be honest, I probably should have just bundled those in together because socio-cultural can be done. Yes, so there's different components of globalization and we can kind of tease them apart, which makes sense, right? I mean, it's a very complicated, big thing. If it wasn't more complicated, then we're ignoring something. So, ideas of global governance. So this is a multitude of actors, including states. Want to put that out there. You know, international institutions. One thing I did notice actually when looking at the essays was international institutions were treated as if they were acting beyond kind of state decision making. Many, if not all, international institutions have quite a significant degree of state involvement in decision-making processes. It might be certain states, but there are definitely states involved in making decisions. Sometimes the institutions will go kind of against what the states want, but not very often. You know, an example of this would be the. Sorry, I put my drink down. I forget that that's loud. An example of this would be, what's it called? The ILO, the International Labour Organization. It's a very old organisation, but its funding is always problematic because part of its funding is from states. And in the 1970s, the ILO was pushing for a very kind of Keynesian understanding of how to understand the relationship between workers and the state. Whereas at the time, in the 70s, for example, the United States was pushing for kind of a more neoliberal model. And because of this disagreement, the United States actually pulled out and pulled their funding, and it knocked about a third or something of the funding off the ILO. So the ILO has to come to some kind of understanding of how do we appease the funding as well as everything else. Now, the ILO is interesting because it's also shot through with issues in terms of trying to represent corporations, states, and worker unions at the same time. But yes, it is not independent of states. It has to keep in mind that states are there and that states are involved and that states are where the funding comes from. So yeah, keep that in mind. I want to throw that out there. You know, the UN, for example, collection of states, and in many cases is subject to the whims of the Security Council, for better or worse. But in terms of this, it's testing the full extent of state sovereignty. Now, to some extent, we could look at this as a changing idea of state sovereignty, but there's certainly something going on here in relation to how much a state can influence its own institutions. And this ties into economic governance as well. Things like the IMF and the World Bank. Which we come to later. But yeah, some formal institutions form the collection of states. There can be some realist-like jostling. Things like the Security Council involve, a reasonable degree of self-interested states doing stuff within the institution that looks realist. How realist that really is, considering it's talking about stuff within an international institution, which fundamentally doesn't matter because it's not proper power, is debatable. But you can use a lot of the kind of the self-interest ideas that come from realism to fully understand. I mean, sometimes it can be very petty in terms of how states behave, especially in the Security Council. Yes, there's also the influence of non-state actors as well. So whilst there are states as a big component of this, we're seeing NGOs, individuals. Now, individuals, you wouldn't think an individual has that much power, but if you think about Bono, for example, Bono has a horrible habit of just showing up and going, I'm here, I have an idea on how development should go, you're going to listen to me, otherwise I'm going to step in front of these cameras and tell everyone that you don't care about poor starving kids in Africa. That's a huge amount of power. Like, he may not be able to make actual decisions within a state system, but he can certainly get the ear of someone, and being annoying if he wants to. But yes, on top of that, NGOs who work together with international institutions and sometimes with states as well. It's very much kind of a complex web. This is why constructivism works quite nicely, because it can trace links and norms and things like this. But this also raises questions of legitimacy and accountability. NGOs, for example, they're not necessarily accountable to anyone, right? Greenpeace, if Greenpeace decided to go off in a particular direction, they're not really accountable to anyone except maybe those funding them. But even then, maybe they can find funding elsewhere. Greenpeace is a weird example. In the US, PETA, they get a lot of flack because they have quite dramatic methodologies in terms of approaching things. So yes, be wary of that. Now, in terms of what IR lens is, I mean, as I say, for the Security Council, jostling, a bit of realism, a bit of self-state interest and that sort of thing. For looking at the kind of the more utopian, optimistic views of this, we could use liberalism. But generally, things like constructivism are going to be really top tier for this, right? Because you could have like a network of things with the links between them, and then you know who's influencing what, and you can understand the institutions quite nicely. There's quite a lot of constructivist work looking at the development and continuation of institutions, which is kind of cool. There's also some that's verging on social Darwinism, which is a bit naff, but that's kind of your decision to make. So yeah, there are others. I mean, you could look at global governance as being a continuation of prior colonial practices. There's quite an interesting book called No Promised Palace or something. One sec. It's a 30th text, but it's very good. It's about essentially the idea that the UN, or the League of Nations, was a continuation of kind of British colonial policy, and then the UN ends up inheriting a lot of that from it as well. So that's an interesting thing to look at. One sec, let me. So the Mazawa, there we are. Very interesting read. No Enchanted Palace by Mazawa. So if you wanna look at the idea of colonial continuation in modern global governance, that's a good place to start. In fact, I'll be kind and I'll throw the reference up on the screen for you. No, Sufficing Wilkinson one. It's this one. So this Mazawa one. 2009, No Enchanted Palace, The End of Empire and the Ideological Origins of the United Nations. Very interesting book. Well worth a look at. If only the introduction. And if you want a PDF of the introduction, I think I even have one I can send to you because I'm that great, apparently. But yes, I do have the introduction. So if you want that, send me an email. I'll send it to you. So yeah, that was a little bit of a sidetrack, but it's interesting and useful. Right. Okay, international political economy. And I'm in the way of this why, but fuck it. Globalization has been facilitated by influences global economic changes. Technological changes in transportation, changes in communication have altered the way the global economy works, the way production lines work, and things like that. Hey Rob. So yeah, this has changed how industry works and business operates. This has had, if you want to trace the current political crises pretty much anywhere, then you just have to look at the way the international political economy has shifted, right? On top of that, we see things like the World Bank, the IMF. They determine a lot of the way these structures are formed. However, I'll throw this in there, because of the changing nature of globalization and kind of the shrinking, not gone, but certainly shrinking Western dominance, we're starting to see less Western-centric international governmental organizations getting involved here. So we've got the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, We've also got the New Development Bank as well. Again, this raises legitimacy questions for some of these organisations, or for all of these organisations. But there's certainly a changing landscape. At the same time, though, it's worth noting that a lot of the structures, the kind of institutional structures that we see arising from essentially these BRICS-centric institutions, are essentially similar to the existing institutions. So there's definitely some kind of institutional continuation here. Neoliberal economic policy changes things. Keynesianism, state-centric economic policy is on the back foot. There's a cat. The role of international finance as well. So I'll throw this in there as kind of this is a sneak peek of the third year module. The sovereign debt crisis in Argentina, it's very interesting in terms of we end up with private finance being able to determine what a state does, because the state ends up in such debt to them that they have to determine how to pay back the debtors, and then they have to restructure and things like this. It's quite phenomenal to think that these private financial actors have such an ability to influence state policy and things like this. Of course, they do also have the support of the US behind them. Without that, maybe they'd be a bit less able to push things. Similarly, when the Chinese banks want something, there's probably going to be a bit of Chinese state influence. 1 second, please. There you go. You feed later. Apologies. So yes, it's worth noting. Like, this is big. What you follow the money, you find. Yeah, cats. I did try and kick her out, but she just stayed in. So yes, I mean, I can bring the cat to the seminar if you want. Probably be a bit of a pain on the train, but get one of those like backpacks with the weird window. Anyway, so yes, international political economy. Okay, so moving on from that, regionalism. Again, this is an interesting one, kind of a dual relationship with globalization, right? This can be seen as a process moving towards globalization. States glob together into regions, and then those regions glob together into a globe. But at the same time, we can also see this as a process of protecting individual states from the full force of globalization. So there's kind of a binary thing going on here. We saw that with the reading, I think in the English School Week, where it's a discussion of solidarism versus pluralism in terms of certain regional integration within Africa. So keep that reading in mind. I keep referring back to it because it's a really good one for this. We have the examples: ASEAN, the EU, the African Union as well, the Arab League, the GCC. Arab League GCC is a bit more interesting, a bit problematic. Formal institutional arrangement, but what does this require? What level of formal institutional arrangement, and that sort of thing. And there's also, are there issues in assuming the homogeneity purely based on geographic proximity? So, for example, the Middle East question, right? Now, those of you who did the essays on, again, quite enjoyed those essays, they were good ones. The Middle East is not an overly cohesive region. There are components that are more cohesive, such as the Arab League, for example, but the Arab League cannot, or is highly unlikely to include Israel and Iran. I'd be very surprised if that ever happened. Maybe some kind of like burnt out husk of Israel, but not Israel as it stands at the moment. So yes, and this kind of comes into what IR approaches might we take when looking at regionalism. So again, constructivism, I'm going to keep selling this because it's so useful. But also, the English school is very useful here in terms of pluralism versus solidarism. This idea of cultural differences and how they might help or hinder the construction of global society or a global social identity. The same with cosmopolitanism as well. So yes, there's a lot to be said, and these institutions, whilst they exist have varying levels of success at various things, and also varying levels of kind of aims. ASEAN has lesser aims than, say, the EU, and the African Union is problematic, but at the same time it does do certain things well. Again, though, we could look at this from a realist perspective and say, okay, well, these are just extensions of state power expressed as regional organizations. You know, the EU is just an expression of German power. ASEAN is an expression of, I suppose, I'm not sure who would be the powerhouse there. The African Union, South Africa, and then the Arab League becoming more kind of Saudi there. Yes. And kind of liberalism as well. You can see this as federalization. So, nationalism and cosmopolitanism. Identity and globalization and before. Grounded in IR theory, critical theory and solidarist English school lean heavily on cosmopolitanism. Critical theory, because it relies on that emancipatory kind of fundamental underpinning. It is freeing people from oppression, and therefore all people end up following the same kind of moral standard, and that is where we end up with cosmopolitanism. And solidarist English school as well, because it's possible to have it together. Constructivism is useful in discussing the construction of identity, not necessarily pushing for the construction of identity in the same way as critical theory, for example. Critical theory, especially Andrew Linklater, very much pushing quite hard for the construction of this cosmopolitan identity. I'm in the way of the thing again. There we are. But constructivism is very much more looking at how it's constructed rather than trying to construct it. With growing interconnectedness through globalization, is there potential for more cosmopolitan values to spread? Or the skeptical view of it, is there just more potential for a conflict of different ideas and different cultural values? Again, solidarist versus pluralist. Nationalism as the before and after. The history of nationalism is interesting. It's as the state appears as an institution, there needs to be a way of uniting the people within the state in some form of political community, and that's kind of when nationalism really kicks off. And it becomes very useful in that sense. But it also becomes problematic when viewed with the state as a problematic political institution within globalization. Anyone that's read the news anytime recently will know that we are starting to see that kind of become an issue. And by kind of become an issue, I mean it's a screaming damn problem that won't go away. But yes, constructivism is going to be very helpful in the construction of identity and such. We can also link this into maybe some kind of more economically focused Marxist stuff, looking at the idea of nationalism as community building and community construction in a capitalist world of individualism, which breaks down local communities, and therefore people need something to feel a part of. And nationalism gives them that. And yes, is there some manifestation of a nationalist response to globalization? Is this a genuine resurgence, or is this a panicked yelp of a diminishing nationalist power base? It depends on where you look, I suppose. Both ends are kind of the Brexit debate, which I don't want to cover too much. You can kind of see a bit of both. A nationalist power base, and also kind of a nationalist base of those that feel they gain their main identity from nationalism. So yes. And the reading for that, I think, is the reading on the construction of walls. That's an interesting reading, and it's worth looking into. Okay. So war. Globalization and the effect on war. I did the lecture, so if you're thoroughly confused, my fault. I also did the seminar, so if you're really thoroughly confused, my fault. Hopefully you're not. But yes, globalization is having an effect on war. The monopoly on violence that was once associated with the Westphalian notion of the state is diminishing. The idea of the state was essentially that you gave up your ability to be violent because the state was there to do it for you. If you cross the channel and start beating people up, it's different, and you're not allowed to do that. Whereas if the state were to do that, then it has some legitimacy to it because of the construction of the state. Global market is also changing the idea of war. A lot of these different components of globalization traverse into this. So it's now plausible to fight a war without having manufacturing, without having a state to support the army, etc. You can essentially just hire an army, roll on in there, and kind of do your own thing. And that is kind of a big shift, a big change in the way that we understand conflict. Almost looking at like pre-ish nation-state, Westphalian nation-state conceptions of conflict. Because we have seen this before, you used to be able to hire entire armies, mercenary armies, but this is kind of slightly something different. How we study war is changing as well. Historically, because of that positivist understanding and the state centrism, IR has generally examined war from a top-down perspective. However, there's a rising trend of examining war from the bottom up as well. Now, the top-down perspective comes with issues in terms of it might miss things, it might miss certain power relations, and ignore certain perspectives on conflict, which the bottom-up approach might offer. The reading for that week is especially good for that, and have a look at the extended reading as well. Mary Cowdell's New and Old Wars, which I will continue to sell to the end of time because it's a very good book. I think I even have it somewhere. I can't see it. Shit. But yes, that's a very good book as well. Both of these have advantages and disadvantages, right? That top-down view is very good at getting a broad understanding of conflict, a broad understanding of war, and the relationship of conflict. Whereas it ignores the nitty-gritty down on the ground stuff, the actual experience of conflict, which some say within the literature that bottom-up approach, that kind of down-on-the-ground perspective, is what discussions of war need in order to drag it out of this kind of rationalist approach that ends up just getting people killed, essentially. But yes, different conceptions of warfare. Also rolls into ethics of morality of war, which I won't go into. Yes, it is changing. Okay, so humanitarian intervention. Talking about the morals and ethics of war. Further to changing nation of the state is the discussion of humanitarian intervention. So this is essentially war, right? But it's moral war, or it's war that's good, or war that's right. Is, depending on who you ask, considered that the state has complete sovereignty. Should have proofread these slides. Over its territory. However, with the responsibility to protect and other interventionist ideas, we start to see that change. This comes down to this changing conception of security, which again is tied into globalization. It's tied into things like cosmopolitanism. So we're starting to see a shift from the understanding of a moral community being within the state or the nation to a moral community on a global level, and that rides into this kind of changing conception of security. We're moving from national security, where people's security is based upon their nationality, to the idea of human security, where they're given security essentially because they're human, not a particular citizen of a state or whatever. And this is where a lot of the interventionist side of things comes from. Yes, it's compatible with cosmopolitanism. People suffering are human first and their nationality second. With state sovereignty, that's highly problematic because it opens the door for a whole lot of interventionist justifications, which involve essentially not fulfilling or ignoring state sovereignty. Kind of a big problem. And there's also, because of that, ends up being unevenly distributed in terms of who gets intervened with and who doesn't. And then, purely on top of that, we can tie that into the English school debates. Solidarism versus pluralism. Who is anyone to impose their moral standards upon others? From the pluralist perspective, the intervention might be there to justify supporting a right that isn't considered natural or whatever within a certain community or a certain society. So problematic in that sense. Also, you can kind of tie post-colonialism into this as well. You can see this as being, again, an extension of kind of colonial attitudes of, we know what's best for you, we're going to make sure that you do it, kind of thing. So keep that in mind. There you go. Not a bad meme. It's not. I appreciate the use of Comic Sans. Top meme. Okay. So, moving on further, looking at the idea of kind of global understandings of moral basis terrorism. So typically the subject matter of international relations is bound to the state. Threats emanate from other states and their military capacity, and they are countered by states and their military capacity. As with the prior slide, we're seeing a change in conception of security, and the slide before it as well, the idea of war changing as well. And terrorism fits into this quite neatly. Terrorism as an act is usually defined as the use of violence for political purposes, but then it also becomes hard to distinguish from war. And also there's a lot of, because it's been quite hot for quite a while, there's a lot of scientists doing some interesting work on terrorism without, let's say, proper epistemological or wariness. So keep that in mind. But yes, be wary of your definitions, essentially. We often distinguish between terrorist violence and state war, but this distinction is problematic because we know that state terrorism also exists. But again, that's generally seen as legitimate because it's the state, and the state has a legitimate use of violence, kind of thing. So keep that in mind. Defining what is and what isn't, very problematic. And also political as well. As it says here, keep in mind that it has been historically quite beneficial since the start of the war on terror for states to take an internal problem and describe it as terrorism, because then they get the US involved and the US goes, oh well, we're fighting terrorism, so here, have loads of money, guns and such. So yes, the definition process is a political act in itself. That makes me sound like a postie, but I am. But keep that in mind as well. It is not a value-free term, and those that use it as a value-free term, read that work critically, essentially. I mean, read all work critically, but that especially, with extra rigor. Okay. There you go. That's okay. Not top meme, but alright meme. So, poverty and development. We're getting there. Even further down the line of reframing our understanding of security, we're starting to see, as we see the understanding of security move into humanity as a global community, we're starting to see cosmopolitanism kick off. We start to see the understanding of what security is and what a threat that requires security is. And we start to see it expand into things like poverty, security from threats of poverty, hunger, disease, domestic violence, things like this. Now, on the kind of critical end of things, those that, or at least those that critique this, they state that this is broadening the understanding of security too wide. It's going to become too difficult to understand what security is because we are looking at too much. However, and I think in the seminars we discussed this, what is a greater threat to most of the global community? Is it war, or is it a large economic downturn that ends up essentially, especially those at the bottom, killing them through poverty or disease and things like this? I mean, nuclear war kind of ignored there because that's a threat to everyone. We all just get turned into radioactive dust, but fingers crossed that doesn't happen. So yes, the manifestation of this politically is the UN Millennium Development Goals. And it also manifests in a changing focus for IR literature as well. So we start to see food security become quite prevalent, especially with things like a changing climate. So keep that in mind as well. There's a lot of components to this, and in terms of like looking at approaches to IR, constructivism is going to be so useful here again all the time. Constructed ideas of security, constructed ideas of threat. The constructed threat of terrorism, for example, arguably much higher than it need be. To be fair, so yes. Versus the constructed threat of climate change, which, if you're in London at the moment, I'm sure you're reasonably aware people are upset about a little bit. Okay. And then the environment. Nice segue. Didn't mean that. Following the theme from the last two slides, again, opens up a referent object of IR. Humans can be understood as part of the environment in which we live and upon which we rely. So there's two ways of looking at this, the anthropocentric and the ecocentric. Now, a lot of even things like human security, the Millennium Development Goals even, rely on an anthropocentric understanding. And that can be potentially problematic, because if you push for a world where everyone has a fundamental degree of material wealth, where does the need of the planet, where do the resource distribution issues come into that, things like that, and that's where you can kind of push more towards ecocentrism. Is there a potential for human security to conflict with environmental security? And the normative theories as well get tied into this. Netflix has the David Attenborough Our Planet thing on at the moment, which is good. I'll sell that. It's interesting. But it is heavy on the we're fucking up the planet narrative. And yeah, kind of takes joy out of it a little bit, but I suppose that's the point, right? But yeah, watch that if you like nature stuff. And yeah, can cosmopolitanism reconcile human security with environmental security? More vitally, can state-centric perspectives reconcile national security and environmental security? That's the big one, because the state is still going to act in a fairly state manner, oftentimes in a fairly self-interested manner. How is it going to be plausible to avoid everything just collapsing into a big mess because of ecosystem collapse, while reconciling that with state sovereignty? I don't know. If I had the answer to that question, I'd be making a lot more money than I do right now. So yes. There you go. That's not a bad meme. I quite like that one. Okay. Cool. Any questions from that? Any questions from that? That kind of dump of information. Issues, concerns, problems. Is there anything that was unclear? Any issues that you can feel you would have trying to answer that in something like that in an exam? Throw it in the chat. I'll have a look. All good then? Sweet. Okay. Right. So, I was thinking maybe another tea break, and then we'll talk about the exam, although I might just burn straight through that because that was only like 35 minutes. It wasn't the 50-minute marathon that the previous lot was. Okay, so the exam. It will look a bit like, well, look a lot like the past paper on Keats. If you haven't looked at that already, take a good look, have a good gander. It's 3 hours, I know, I'm sorry. You'll be fine. You just make sure you know the stuff, be confident with it, and you should be okay. Be prepared, don't skimp on revision. That 3 hour thing, that sucks. I feel for you. So yeah, these are the questions. So, I mean, have a look at these. These aren't the questions from the exam. They're the questions from the past exam. But they're fairly, they're fairly kind of answerable, right? So, security is an essentially contested concept, right? So we've just approached that already. Is it human security? Is it national security? Is it environmental security? Food security? Things like this. And then you could extend that to say one concept of security, it goes too far in terms of opening the floodgates, whereas another might be too narrow and things like this. You could have a look at, say, the question 6, explain the way in which constitutive theories challenge the explanatory mainstream. So we could look at how essentially post-positivism and critical approaches are looking at the way in which the world is studied, the way in which we understand the world, and things like this. So you could do like a comparison between like realism / liberalism ish and like critical theory or something. I mean, the realism critical theory thing, that's quite a good binary to go with, because critical theory really dug into realism in quite a hard way. So read some CT and you'll see quickly that they really like kick the shit out of realism. It's quite useful. So yes. What else we got here? How useful is the concept of international society? Again, we've kind of already looked at things like this. You could do a English school solidarism versus pluralism understanding of what international society is, and that would be a good kind of two-part answer to that question. And then question 1, which ism offers the most compelling account of world politics? Hell, just go with the one you like the best, and have a good old crack at any that oppose it, keeping the argument balanced, of course. But yeah, everyone will probably have their own kind of popular approach that they lean towards, so go with the flow, don't fight that. But yeah, once you've got the heaviest part of the revision out of your way, like utilize the past paper, run a mock session. How in depth should our answers be? Should we provide examples and main authors? So main authors are going to be helpful to throw in if you can if that's how your brain works and you're good at kind of memorizing names to go along with approaches. Do so. When revising, when looking through the material from the module, get the main points down, maybe get a name or two next to them. So like world system theory or Marxism, you could throw Wallerstein next to it. Post-structuralism, you could throw like Foucault or Derrida. Critical theory, you could like stick Andrew Linklater or Robert Cox next to it. In terms of examples, so due to the way that the module's been structured, you should be able to draw examples from the second semester stuff. But that being said, if you have examples to approach a theoretical question, for example, that offer beyond that, go ahead with that. That works as well, right? As long as it's reasonably well supported and it's not kind of dubious. So yes, so whatever detail that you feel you can fit in, essentially. I'm not really going to offer a minimum there, I'm afraid. Yes. Okay, so yes, once you've got the heaviest part of the revision out of the way, utilize this past paper, run a mock session. Yeah, it's going to be a bit of a shitty 3 hours, but you'll have an idea on what the experience is. Try it handwritten, go under exam conditions. I don't know about you, but I can't handwrite worth shit. So that's something that I probably would need to practice if it came to doing the exam. So keep that in mind as well. And essentially use it as kind of a mock, as it were. And then sit back, maybe leave your answers for a bit, come back to them and think critically about how they look. If you want, you can use the marking criteria. It's on Keats, and think about how well it fulfills that. be aware that the marking criteria is generally for essays, and the exam marking is generally a bit more lax because it's recognised that it's under certain conditions. But it's a useful guideline for how you judge your own work, and it should be quite useful to try to judge. It's difficult as well. So yeah. On top of that, so yeah, I have that voluntary component on top of what is already a voluntary live stream. This is a set of revision slides that I have. It's essentially kind of like some basic advice on revision and structuring revision and things like that. Stick around if you want to see it. Feel free to go and do other things if you'd like. So yeah, so I'll here we are. Are our answers supposed to strictly focus on the question, or can we elaborate on it to go beyond it? With that time restriction, I would say stick to the question. You have an hour to get that essay thought out, planned, and written, and then you need to move on to the next one, right? If you feel you can extend on some of the ideas within that time frame, rock on. Make sure you answer the question though. When you reach the end, make sure you answer the question. I would also say make sure you have a written plan of what you're doing in the exam in that particular essay, because that means that as a marker, even if you run out of time, myself or Keith, whoever ends up marking them, will get to see what exactly the plan was. It won't necessarily get you extra grades, but it might give context to an argument that would otherwise be kind of free floating. So yes, I would say focus on the question first and foremost because you have a limited time. But if you feel you can do more within that time, rock and roll. Again, you can only really judge how much you can do yourself. I've seen people that have managed to write unfathomable amounts in an hour. I don't understand how they've done it. And yet I've also seen people write perfectly good essays that were perfectly on point and with maybe half the words or whatever. So yes, that would be my advice on that one. Okay, so yeah, I'll take more questions, I think, and then I'll go on to like the revision advice after that. But if there are any more issues, questions, thoughts on the exam, I'll stick the mock questions up just to kind of give you an idea on it. Are we all happy? What's the general feel approaching this? I know it's quite early in the revision kind of period, but do like a smiley face or something. How you feeling about this? I'll do one as well. Maybe that one. Like that. There you go. That work? Don't know. Okay, I'm seeing a good smile. Good. So yeah, sad face. Confused face. Okay. Cool. So, confused face. Is there anything in particular shocked? Okay. Cool. Well, we can hopefully deal with that. So yeah, use the mock stuff. Use the stuff you have already. There shouldn't be too many big surprises. This isn't an exam where it's designed to catch you out or to punish you. This is literally to test your knowledge of the module. If you go through the seminar notes that you have, if you don't have any seminar notes, go through the slides that I've uploaded, go through the lectures, have a look at the readings, jot down key terms and that sort of thing, and generally kind of find a way to get comfortable with it. I suppose that's really the best bit of advice I can give. Yeah, okay. Cool. I did like a smiley face with like the sweating because I'm pretty happy that you all can do it. I'm just I'm nervous for you. 3-hour exam. But you'll be okay. Right. Okay. So, I'll go through this revision thing just to kind of give you an idea on like how you might go about structuring revision. This might be useful for you, it might not. It depends on how much of this kind of thing you've done before. But yeah, it's quite fun. It's a bit lighthearted. It's cool. So I'll just go through it. It won't take long. So yeah. Oh shit, I forgot about that. I put some tiny snack comic stuff in this. Again, it's an older bit of work, but tiny snack comics are great. Definitely worth looking at if you haven't looked at them. So yes, time management. Draw up a timetable. Allocate breaks. Mix up the topics so there's a variety from day to day. This is probably when you get to like the bulk of the revision. I use Google Calendar to block out days if I need to, or when I need to, because I always need to. Draw up a timetable. Make sure you know what you're doing, when you're doing. If you spend the morning doing one module, try revising for another module in the afternoon, so that you don't burn out. Keep it fairly balanced. Things like this. This is actually it's a couple of years old now, but this is kind of how at one point my week looked. Apparently I didn't have much time for research there, but I think it was a marking week. But yeah, so this is just blocking things out like this is quite a good way to go about it. Just big blocks like that. Find a quiet space. Oh, curse me for putting the... There we go. Find a quiet space, or if you need like noise cancelling headphones or something, use those. You know where you work best. Follow that, stick to it. Try to be fairly strict with yourself, that sort of thing. If you work best with other people, get together some kind of study group. Certainly come along to Keith's revision sessions as well. I think they're next week. They should be useful. Well, they will be useful because it's Keith. We all love Keith, right? So yes, get down to it in the morning or in the evening. It depends on how you work best, but try to stick to the schedule. We've already written up a timetable, right? So try and stick to it. You will know, or you might not know at this point, but you'll very quickly learn when you work best for things like revision. 6 hours of board games. Yeah, it was. I don't know. It was probably like Battlestar Galactica or something. That's 6 hours of board games. It's a good game. It just takes forever. So yes, schedule accordingly. Stick to it. Spice up your revision. Again, this will depend on people's different learning styles. There's quite a lot of research on this. It's interesting. Use color, diagrams, tables. I know I'm a really bad example for this because my slides are dull, colorless, lifeless voids with the occasional meme like poked in. But it depends on what works best for you. Things like mind maps are very helpful to kind of get an idea on how things work. Maybe draw a landscape of where the theory sits. Think about how it relates to other theory and such. Write up a family tree of theory, that sort of thing. Challenge yourself to practicing questions. So, slides in the lecture contain information on type of question, not necessarily the lecture, but from earlier. Imagine some of those, plan responses, and you should hopefully feel a bit more confident when you walk in. Yeah, essentially the goal is to walk in feeling good, right? Make summary notes, good for quick reference, have like keywords and such. That's kind of why I put the keywords on the tops of the slides for this one, because it helps you know. Have like keywords for different approaches, maybe key authors and things like that. And you can kind of use that as quick reference if you're not quite remembering one bit or the other. And include links to the original text or idea, so that you know where to look for more detail. It essentially becomes a detailed index of your revision. Set goals and reward yourself. you know, on completion of a goal or a particular kind of revision session, relax. You know, plan in leisure time, plan in a time where you can just kind of chill out and not have to worry too much about revision. Otherwise, you'll burn out. You will burn out. You know, I've met PhDs before that start up and they go, oh yeah, I'm just going to work bang, 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 bang. And then after like 3 months, they're burnt out and they have to have like 2 months off because they just couldn't hack it because they didn't leave enough time for leisure. So try and manage your time appropriately. If you want to go and, you know, chocolate, beer, wine, food, Netflix, dank memes, whatever helps you unwind and relax, leave some time for it. You know, if it's going out and getting completely wankered, then sure, leave some time for that. But keep in mind that you have to schedule in a hangover the next day. Although you're not so young, you probably don't get hangovers properly yet. Gits. So yeah, things like this. I use Google Keep for like task setting. So useful for this sort of thing, making sure that everything is done. Google Tasks, heavily Google dependent, but Google Tasks can also be very helpful for this sort of thing. It's attached to Google Mail or whatever. But yeah, having to-do lists can be very helpful, especially with revision. So yes, you can see that this one was literally done while I was preparing these slides. Use your family, friends, fellow students. Use the people around you. You know, bounce your work off people around you. And if your family or friends get tired of you, go and find someone that isn't. Or find a fellow student and talk to them until they're tired of you. Yeah. Again, this would depend on how well it works for you individually. But you know, I remember as an undergraduate, some of the most useful and valuable revision sessions I had were with groups of people. You know, we would do exercises where essentially each one would go and revise one thing in a lot of depth and then present it to the rest of the group after a certain amount of time, because essentially you end up teaching them, and through teaching it you learn, and that sort of thing. So that's useful. That was probably a bit too far. That was like a 12-hour revision session, which I wouldn't recommend, but try and get together into a group, have a group revision session if it helps you. Again, you'll know better. You know the social groups that have occurred in the module better than I do. Don't isolate yourself too much. As part of that, leave time to unwind. Definitely include leave time to see other human beings. Disappearing off the face of the earth for like a month to revise will melt your brain. Humans are gregarious animals. Maybe put together a WhatsApp group or something. I don't know what you kids use or whatever, but hey, Harry, I'm trying to be young doing a live stream. But yes, cool. And ultimately, stay positive. You know, be confident in your revision, be confident in yourself. Read, revise, take notes, walk into that exam room feeling confident. Lucky pants are always an option if it comes to it. If you have issues, problems, concerns, if you're really bricking yourself over this, then send myself or Keith. Sorry, I know someone called Ken. Send myself or Keith an email, or you know, organise a meeting or something, and we'll see what we can do to kind of clear that up. Essentially, a positive attitude walking in there is really going to help you out. Because yeah, we'll just do better. On top of that, what I will say is, because this is a real monster marathon of an exam, make sure you get proper sleep. I'm going to sound like your mum here. Make sure you get proper sleep beforehand. Make sure you're fed. Make sure you've, you know, you weren't cramming until the last minute. I think research shows that cramming until the last minute isn't that helpful anyway, because you take very little of it in. So, you know, the night before, make sure you have enough time to kind of chill out, get some sleep, get some food. Also, leave enough time to get to wherever the exam is being held. Don't be late, things like that. All these things are just stuff that trips people up. We never see it coming because we don't really plan for it. So just keep it in mind. Make sure you're fed, watered, happy, basically. And yeah, be confident. You're smart folks. Everyone on the module has the potential to do this very well. and you probably will. So you're going to be okay, basically. Okay, that's pretty much everything I have for you. Let me move myself back here. Lots there. What I'm going to do is I'm going to make a PDF of these slides, throw it up onto Keats for you to refer to. The VOD of this, I think, will still be available on my YouTube channel. I need to make sure that's set up. If not, apologies for those that weren't there. I think it should be available though. Again, if there are any questions or issues, stick them in chat. I'll give you a response. If that's too public or too annoying, then email myself or Keith. We're pretty good at responding and being human. Thank you for showing up to this. I think we had between like 12 and 13 people show up, which was cool. I hope it was helpful. If there's like another idea of a live stream you can think of that would be helpful, then do say, and I'll see about setting it up close to the time, but we'll have to see. Yeah, thanks all for a great module. Hope it was as good to be a student on as it was to be staff. It's been a very, very enjoyable module. I've enjoyed this an awful lot. So yeah, and again, if you have feedback on the live stream, how it went, any kind of suggestions for improvement, you can email me as well, or put it in chat. You know, be reasonable. But yes, cool. That's pretty much everything I have. I'll leave the chat open for a little while, and I'll respond as and when. But yeah, cool. You'll do fine. Just make sure you revise and make sure you know the stuff. Cool. Good. No worries. Yeah, it's been kind of fun actually to do this. It's a bit like, although it's a bit like one of my bad seminars where I just sit and talk at you for a while. But yeah, happy Easter, you all. Oh, you got a CPS essay. Oof. Good luck with that. Thank you and bye. Have a good one. Cool. No worries. Okay. Cool. I'll probably close this off. That wasn't too bad actually. Almost exactly 2 hours. Again, thank you all for coming, and I'll see you around. Send me an email if you need to. Okay. Bye.